You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Saw the games, physical basketball I was at the games. You were not. You watched them on YouTube. Anyway. I saw the games. I watched the games.
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Moats. Welcome to X's and Joe's, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Weemuth. Welcome you to episode 12, College Basketball Freshmen. How productive should they actually be? Recorded on the afternoon of June 24th, 2024. So, Bob, before we jump into our usual fun, I think we need to run back some items from our last episode 11, where we discussed the movie Hoosiers and the lore surrounding the movie Hoosiers.
Yeah.
We have two corrections and maybe a brief story to add to that episode. So why don't you go ahead and start?
There was a moment when we were talking about the Columbus High School versus Crispus Attucks Sweet 16 game, where I threw out a shooting line for Robertson. And I was confused at the moment, thinking you were being sarcastic, until I realized what I did, because you said that was very efficient. I go, yeah, really efficient. I said he was 12 for 15 from the field. No. He was 2 for 15 from the field. He did better from the line, but it's one of those deals where it's like, and as I was kind of reaching over there in my old age, the transition lenses don't always catch, I got to go high versus low sometimes, and it just threw me off. So the IDS regrets the error.
Yeah, or the Washington
Post.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I know, and there was also another minor one as well that will keep you in good graces with the people of Terre Haute.
Exactly. Considering I'm going back there pretty soon. And our discussion of the 1954 Milan Gersmeyer game. I guess that was the semifinal of 1954, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. We chatted about that game, and I mentioned in Terre Haute there was this story about the controversy surrounding the foul total for the Andrews twins, and the belief in Terre Haute is that that foul error by the referee assigning a foul to the wrong twin, unfortunately, costing Gersmeyer the game. It was a 1-point game. I had said that during our conversation around the Milan game, and you had pointed out, it's like, well, no, Milan beat Gersmeyer by like 12 points. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, okay, I think maybe I got that wrong. It was actually the year prior that Gersmeyer played in the final game in 1953, where that discrepancy had happened and they lost by 1. During some controversy around the foul. So that was my mistake, and my apologies. And yes, this will hopefully absolve me from any blame I get from my Terre Haute brethren when I make my return next week. So
you don't have to mourn the loss of the public library. I'll put it that way.
Yes,
but where else but X's and Joe's are you going to get two guys that care enough about their product to go back and correct themselves on stuff that happened 70 years ago?
Exactly. Well,
here we are.
You and I live in the past anyway, so it doesn't really matter that it happened
That's
decades
true.
before we were actually born.
That's true, you little whippersnapper. I know how that goes.
Yeah, and the story I will share. So after Bob and I posted the episode, or more likely, we did the episode and Jared from Assembly Call posted the episode. My brother Jay, who lives in Houston, he follows the show, and he watched it, and he texted me and reminded me. He said, "You're talking about Boise State. You're talking about Hoosiers. Just to let you know, when I was at Boise State myself, my roommate at Boise State was Steve Charler, who played Raid in the movie Hoosiers." I thought, oh my God.
Oh man.
I vaguely remember that one of my brothers had some kind of interaction with one of the actors from Hoosiers. I don't remember who, I just knew that, vaguely that one of them had some kind of a run-in with them. But yeah, I totally blew it that, yeah, my brother Jay actually roomed with Raid at Boise State in 1986 or whatever it was.
That's amazing.
85. Yeah.
It just goes to also show that the pickup games at Hoosier Boys State are were some of the best in the state.
They must have. It's crazy, right?
they put me on a court someplace at Rose Holman when I was playing that time. But yeah, being said,
you went to Shook Fieldhouse probably.
We were there in the original spot. So I got a chance to stand on the floor that Butch Wade and company stood on.
Shook Fieldhouse. Well, yeah, that was like it was basically an aluminum tin dome that they stuck the basketball arena in there. I spent many nights at Shook Fieldhouse. It's a great place.
Yeah. So welcome back. I know you got a chance to go trudge the Ralph Bellamy acting trail, part of New York, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I was just came back with the wife and son and met up with the in-laws up at New Paltz, New York, which is up in the Hudson Valley area, which I highly recommend. It's the whole area. New Paltz is up there, Woodstock. West Point is just like an exit or two away, so it's really very picturesque part of the Northeast, and of course I love it because of all the history that's up there. I mean, beside West Point, Hyde Park is there, so you get to see the Roosevelt Estate, and yeah, if you've not gone there, especially you. I would have assumed that if you ever get the chance to go to New York State, that would be one of the first places I would recommend. It's not only just a beautiful house and just a beautiful view of the area, because it's kind of like very up high, but just all the history that's in there. I mean, they actually have a copy of his written note, FDR, of his notes from typing up the speech for the Pearl Harbor speech.
Okay,
and he actually has it in there, and it's great. You see him wrote it out, this is a day that will live in world history. And he scratches out world history and puts in infamy. So that's kind of thing I know they would like. So I would definitely say that next time the Moats family comes up this way, I will follow you up there and,
we keep talking. We got to go see the brother-in-law and company out in New Jersey. This, maybe just, the Mike and Bob road trip with the boys.
Yeah, we could do an episode up there.
We could do an episode from West Point.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be something.
Yeah. So, and I'll be making my and so that was the trip I just took, but I will be returning to Indiana in 48 hours. So this is Monday, and Wednesday I'll be landing in Indy and doing my usual Terre Haute and Bloomington loop this time. And I think next week, I guess we'll try to grab some food somewhere.
We'll be in touch. Yeah, we'll coordinate our schedules eventually. With my, basically, you go to New Paltz, I drive through New Palestine yesterday. You go to West Point, I drive by Camp Atterbury. It's a little different, but it's kind of the same thing. But yeah, I mean, I feel like a bit of a pinball these days. So we'll touch base here fairly soon, and with any luck, get together here in the next few days.
Exactly. We'll take pictures for the pod.
We will take pictures. Maybe do like a 30-second video up front of where we're eating.
We'll do something. I'm sure we'll find some way to integrate something from our meeting for the show.
Yeah, have my wife actually take the video or something. She's like, I'm not gonna be able to that.
Yeah.
So we hear our good friend Tony's doing something kind of fun and exciting. He's got something. He's already done it.
He's an author. He's done it. Yeah, it's over. He is now a published author. Winning Together, the Ultimate Guide to Parenting in Sports, is now available in Amazon. I've not gotten to read it yet because I think it has literally just gone into print recently. Mm-hmm. So I'm in the process of ordering one, and I know you probably are too, but the focus is on the parent side of sports, not necessarily just the coaching side.
Exactly. And I've already kind of said that, after over the years talking to Tony about this stuff, and as we've had our conversations, he's always come at this from a very logical, rational, and loving view for, what our kids should get out of youth sports. And I've already kind of said, hey, this is going to probably be mandatory reading, or at least a mandatory copy will be purchased for multiple sports programs throughout Bartholomew County if I can get certain things done. Because I think it is something that it's time that we kind of talk about just what are parental roles, because I think it's hard to know what you're supposed to do as a mom or a dad, and trying to help your kid get the most out of it while at the same time dealing with, all the issues of just the issues surrounding the cultures of youth sports, and the best way to clean it up, I think, is through education and awareness, and also just saying that, you're not alone as a parent, and here are some good tips for you to help your kid and help others' kids as well. And that's the other kick in the backside for coaches.
Yeah, and reminding parents that the sports are for the kids, not for the parents.
For you, no. Yeah, yes. So looking forward to getting that as a good summer read, and then also want to congratulate Austin Render on his new podcast here on the Back Home Network, the Dribble Drive, which highlights the women's game on the Big Ten level, kind of more of a 35,000 foot view of what's going on throughout the women's game, and as it's exploding in popularity, seeing how that's structured and how it's working, and how different teams and different programs are doing what they do on a day-to-day basis to be successful in the women's game. So Austin, I got a chance to listen to the first episode. It was great. I really, really enjoyed it, and looking forward to hearing more from you. So congratulations, Austin.
Yep. Our whole family's growing.
Yeah. And by the way, Austin, we're not kidding. You get the check.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of the family growing, I think Homefield added some new schools, right? They
seem to be growing. I don't know. It just seems like every week I notice there's something else going on. I saw Evergreen State is dropping on Friday.
I got my email with the link to the show in it, and like 5 above it was the Evergreen. I'm like, okay, there's Evergreen State. I know they did the Fighting Okras recently.
Yeah, Delta State.
Delta State. Thank you. Delta State. I've actually studied Delta State. They have some interesting onboarding freshman orientation processes. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
They're just a really good. So it's, I think, Mississippi, I believe.
Yes, it's down in literally in the Delta. So
literally in the Delta. So, but obviously we have the UC Irvine, right? The Fighting Slugs, banana slugs.
Yes, the banana slugs.
And I saw that shirt and I thought, there's not a better shirt. Like, let's say you have a rough morning at the office. The day just hasn't gone well. The intern screws up, and you kind of need to change clothes midway through the day because the company car no longer is operational. You can't use it. Mm-hmm. And you're looking for that perfect shirt to go out to breakfast with your buddy because the burger he had and the Sprite he washed it down with is worn off. I give you the banana slugs from UC Irvine shirt. Where you too can get hosed off with the garden hose and put that on.
Exactly.
And
I like where you're going with this.
Yeah. And I mean, it like all Homefield shirts, has a lot, if you need to pack your work items in your shorts, whether it's a phone or it's a 357 Magnum, hand cannon, as you're going out to breakfast that morning to, do your thing. I guarantee you, if you get these shirts, you will not look like a couple of dorks.
Yeah, exactly.
You
call Harvey Keitel to fix your problems.
Fix your problem, yeah. You got to call the consultant in to drive really fast, and 30 minutes later, you're all good to go.
I'm wondering what percentage of the audience is picking up on this versus the ones like, what the hell are they talking about?
Put the kids to bed and watch Pulp Fiction. Maybe put the wife to bed too. You never know. Put the husband to bed. It's. If you haven't seen it yet, I don't know. I don't know if that's even possible. I find it almost hard to believe.
Yeah, it was released. I was just looking at that a few weeks ago. It was released, I remember, in March of 1996, and we were at school then. And I remember they always used to release them on Tuesdays, right? Because that's when VHS release happened. I remember I ran down after my morning class. There was a video store out near the Chocolate Moose.
Yep.
In Bloomington. And that was like always the place I went to rent videos. I went there early, and literally it was about the time they were opening. And there was already people like streaming in to grab Pulp Fiction. And it was on pretty quickly because that just the rage that was happening around that movie at the time. It's very 1996 sort of vibe. And the thing I do remember about that is that Tuesday, Pulp Fiction was released on VHS. That next Friday, I went to see Fargo at the movies at the actual theater because it was just released. So literally, Pulp Fiction on Tuesday, on VHS, and then Fargo was in the movie theaters like just days later. So
you can't get more 90s than that, I don't think.
Exactly. and we're going to have an episode in the next few weeks that's going to be all nothing but the 90s. So that's that'll be a maybe a fun preview to that. So.
Let's talk about the Nightfall. So, yeah. So when we get started here, we're going to talk about what we should expect from freshman players. And really, it's an episode we've been wanting to do for a while, and with situations, it's kind of changed. But so when we come back, we're going to talk about, we're going to get started on freshman performances.
Welcome back to X's and Joes. I'm Mike Weemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats. Yeah, so Bob, I was thinking in preparation for the show, given how much has changed in the game in recent years, especially because of the portal, an episode about freshman productivity and expectations around that probably would have been much higher on our podcast priority list if this was, say, 2010. Mm-hmm. It may have been an episode that, it would have been definitely one of the first few just out of the chute if we had done this podcast, back right in the pre-portal days, let's say. But nevertheless, freshmen have to play somewhere. So, there's still some value in doing this. And I can say, I think one of the biggest challenges I've had in discussing recruiting since I started doing this is the idea that fans don't really have a very good grasp of what to expect from freshmen. Mm-hmm. Typically, there's always an overshooting rather than an undershooting of expectations when it comes to what they can expect freshmen to actually achieve. So I think there's some value in discussing this, and I think despite some of the changes in the landscape, I think we could probably lay some pretty interesting guidelines, I guess, for fans to look at, because I would say this episode may be best categorized as a pod about expectations as much as it is about what freshmen actually do. I mean, we're going to discuss what freshmen do, but I think a lot of it is about, okay, well, how do you react to that? Or how do you actually, as a fan, a coach, a player, a media member, analyze this, just knowing what the realities are. So
I don't remember, were you and I at that game in 2000, the Mike Davis's second game against UK? So it would have been 2001. Did you and I go to, I can't remember if I was actually at that game. And IU got...
Is that the one where he got the technical at the end?
No, that was 2002. That was after the national championship run.
Yeah.
So that December before the run, IU has a really poor game against Kentucky. Yeah. And Davis is in the, in his post-game press conference.
Yeah.
And he kept repeating the line, help is on the way.
On the way.
And we were talking Bracey Wright. We were talking Marshall Strickland. We were talking Rod Wilmont. Mm-hmm. At that point, there was a little bit of juice coming into the program from a standpoint of recruiting. Even before then, IU would always, that the nucleus of that group of Jared Jeffries and Jeff Newton, Dane Fife, those were some strong classes. Yeah. In a different world, Luke Recker plays on that team, I might add. Luke Recker would have been around for that. That year. Kirk Haston was there the year before, although he really, but he had a really good freshman year, if I recall correctly. Jason Collier had, gone through. And so we were kind of aware of this idea that we were trying to, and that's when you and I were really talking early on when I had hair. We were talking about the types of players Indiana needs. Mm-hmm. And Mike Davis is now basically admitting that in front of the entire basketball world, that said, we don't have the guys. They almost win a national championship, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But he too said, that's mindset of it. Ever since that time of help is on the way, I think that's best defined how we've as IU fans looked at.
Yeah, I think exactly. That's probably the first time I remember a coach just overtly saying that, so clearly, just after a loss. Right. I mean, you hear coaches always talking about recruiting in terms of, say, off season being kind of vague. Oh, well, we think we're getting, these kind of players. This is the kind of players we're looking for. Mm-hmm. I can't remember the last time or a time before that where a coach literally said, yeah, we kind of lost this game because we just don't have the players, but the players are coming. So the cavalry is, just rounding the bend and will be here next year.
And that kind of, again, goes to what a coaching expectations at this point. Like, what does a coach, what do they want from those players, those 18-year-old kids who are just coming to campus for the first time? And I mean, you and I, we did watch games where I remember we had tickets at the time when both with definitely Luke Recker. I remember we had tickets together when Luke Recker played, and it was like a breath of fresh air. What is this?
Yeah.
And you take it even to Collier the year before that, where we would watch some Collier games, and it's like, well, he's obviously struggling, but he was still doing a pretty amazing job. Or the 2 years before that with the Patterson, Miller, and Reed class. What was the expectation that the coach, that Bob Knight had, other coaches have? And I think a lot of times coaches have this expectation that they are looking for guys to come in and grow. I think that's the first element to this. And when you really think about the number of kids who over the years have played as freshmen, how many of them are really 4-year starters? There are many, many, many more players like a Charlie Miller than there are a Steve Alford.
True.
And especially in the last few years, because with the COVID years, and we're going to talk a little bit about, just what's happened recently with freshmen and BPM. Meaningful minutes. And so I don't know at this point. If those of you who are watching us will see this, but you'll notice that there's a bit, I did a quick little scatter map on 2024 freshmen, and meaningful minutes. The way I see it is you're averaging over 10 minutes a game. Mm-hmm. And you look at the baseline, most of your freshmen who are playing meaningful minutes, of which there are 16 dots up here. So of the 16 players that did, the majority of them are under 20 minutes a game. You've got an Owen Freeman out there. I think you may have Gabe Cupson on the other side of the 20 minutes, and Mackenzie Mbako on that other side of the line. But like Purdue had one last year, which was Cam Heide. Mm-hmm. And he was only getting about, I think I got him down to like 10, maybe 11 minutes per game. So when you look at this, you see a high concentration of kids 5 and under in BPM on the other side of the 20 minute a game line. And you go back to 2019, and you'll notice there's a lot more freshmen playing. In fact, there's 31 little dots here. And you see more of what you would call, I would say, more of if I put a trend line up, you would probably see a bit of a trend line that was upwards. So you had a good number of freshmen who were still playing. You had I would say, almost an even split of freshmen who were playing less than 20 and players who were playing more than 20 minutes a game. Players like Romeo Langford are reflected on this screen, by the way, as well as Rob Finnessy during that would be that season. Several for Purdue as well, I believe, that year. Aaron Wheeler, I believe, was on that 2019 group. Was I think
Trevion Williams.
Yes, that's who I was thinking of. That he was on that group also, and so you see kind of but there is more of a kind of a trend line that you have players who are playing more minutes, but you also see more of a variance in the BPM. Mm-hmm. You go to 2013, and you'll notice a similar type of thing where there weren't as many. When you look at the minutes per game, there were more of them at 10. You had again a pretty good concentration, but also it was a bit of a lower number. There's 21 listed, but that's also, I want to keep in mind, that was a 12 team Big Ten that year.
Yeah.
So are we seeing, and I mean, Mike, I guess we've talked about this. If you're looking as a coach, if you're looking for a player to give you an immediate impact, are you going to look for a freshman?
Typically not.
No.
Yeah.
I think, and again, you take out the Dukes, you take out the Kentuckys. This isn't a conversation about the one and done programs.
Yeah.
It's really a conversation like what we're seeing here, which is, okay, we're going to have a very limited number of players play. Mm-hmm. At pre-COVID, it was about 50% of the freshmen were playing meaningful minutes. The other 50, then the lower 50% were basically getting spot minutes here and there. I think Justin Smith is freshman year for Indiana, or a Denise Anderson type situation. Yeah. But then you go into last year in particular, and that number goes, and depending on how you judge how many freshmen were playing, like if you count walk-ons, you count guys like Ja'Kai Newton, you have 55. Yeah. If you only take people who made a meaningful contribution, you have 41. So instead of 50%, it's 40% of your freshmen are getting meaningful minutes. Yeah. And each roster, it comes out to an average of 3 per team versus 4 per team. So teams may be taking less freshmen now with the post-COVID years.
It's crazy because you think about it from the coaching standpoint, and you asked, if you're looking for major contributions, would you want that, or would you expect that from a freshman? And you're right. I mean, unless you're one of the kids that's going to Duke or Kentucky, or typically like one of the top, say 10 kids, that's probably not going to be very likely. And, I'll run through some aggregated numbers later that kind of show sort of that differentiation between, say, like the expected performance of top 10 kids versus kids that are more like in the 80s, 100s, down and outside the top 100. But you're right. It's most coaches are not looking for an immediate impact because they're sensible. They know exactly what the expectation is. So they are really looking for growth rather than immediate impact. And because you think about it, coaches are recruiting over 36 and 48 month time horizons. They're trying to figure out, okay, not just now, but what is the roster going to look like 3 years from now? Obviously, with the portal, that kind of changes. Some of the you have a new channel of players that can come in. They're more immediate impact and they're a little bit older. But if you are going to try to stay in the high school ranks to some degree, you're not going to go completely to the portal 100%. Then you have to think about, okay, the high school kids are going to bring in, what are the ones going to be both able to perform at a high level and actually will be able to stay, be able to actually have an experience here that's not going to want them to immediately jump to another place after they come in their freshman year. So you're right. It's about balancing the talent expectations and the sort of time horizon that's in play.
And I think in the preponderance of cases, a kid will give a coach 2 years. I think a coach will give a kid 2 years. I think if we start breaking down the portal more, that freshman performance metric is going to be less than that. It's not going to be, okay, well, I thought I was going to come in here and play 35 minutes a game and be the number one option on offense. And we'll talk about that kind of as when we talk about players with their expectations. But I mean, I think kids figure out pretty quickly when they're there what this looks like, and that it is harder. There is a learning curve, a very steep learning curve your freshman year. I think what's interesting to me also, as I looked at the aggregated data, just from the teams, is that we've had a bit of a drop in the BPM mean. And I don't know if that's going to be lasting or not. So not only do you have fewer freshmen playing fewer freshmen playing less meaningful time, but also not necessarily performing at the same level as they were as a group, I might add, as a group in those meaningful minutes as efficiently or as effectively as they were.
Yeah, I was finding that your data is concentrated on the Big Ten, and I was finding the same stuff on the national level as well. They're compared from, say, the recent chunk of years versus a decade ago. It's not a huge variance, but there is a variance, and it is to the downside for the current crop of players.
Right. And then exactly. And I think part of that does come, comes down to, we were talking about this. Do I need another sample size? Do I need to sample another conference? Yeah. And I wasn't going to do the ACC or the SEC because of Kentucky and Duke. I think they would unnaturally inflate it. But if I did, let's say, the Big 12, I think I was interested to see that your figures and my figures, and then what Evan Miyakawa was putting out in his most recent article as well. There seems to be a lot of symmetry in this conversation of continuity matters. And if you look at this slide in particular, when you look at the teams where you have the more freshmen are playing, I mean, actually that's not necessarily true, but you have fewer and fewer teams where you have more than one freshman playing. 2 is usually your number. Now, the one of the exception out here, you'll notice if you're looking at this, you'll see that, there's a team that played 3 freshmen meaningful minutes and they had over 30 wins. They're the outlier. That outlier was a 2013 Michigan team.
Yeah.
So that kind of points to, but there you do see kind of a slight downward trending line that the more freshmen you're playing, the less likely you are to win. And a lot of it does come down to, again, what Miyakawa was talking about was the whole idea of continuity. Homegrown continuity may be better than even transfer portal continuity. That if you're adding freshmen, if you're playing 4 freshmen at a time, which I don't think you're going to see too many teams in Power 5 playing 4 freshmen anymore at the same time.
Nope.
Just because of the portal and because of what's available to you. There's just so much variance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about what a player looks like during this time frame. But if you're talking about right now what coaches want, you really want a lot more consistency, and freshmen are far from consistent.
Yeah.
And you also need, and again, you talk to a freshman player and you talking about player expectations. The game goes faster. Windows of opportunity are lessened. I'll give a story from seeing videos. We were at a tournament on a Sunday, and the Saturday before was a sectional final, and Bloomington North was playing Columbus North. And I saw a video of North ran the set beautifully. You couldn't ask for a better execution. And it was Sam King, who's a walk-on at Purdue, doing a handoff to Cooper Horn going in for the layup. He had it wide open. He's going right to the bucket. This is going in. And it was, I think, J.Q. Roberts. Remember him, who's now playing at Vanderbilt, playing for Bloomington North.
Exactly.
He's not even on the help line. He's not even on the modern help line. He's on the short corner. And he closes the distance from the short corner to the other side where Horn is taking up the layup and blocks it and sends the game to overtime. North loses.
Okay.
Columbus North loses.
Yeah.
And you're like, you can't, what do you do against that? That's a division. Now I want to keenly note that's a Division III player taking the handoff from a national runner-up walk-on player from a walk-on on a national runner-up team. Yeah. And the Division I player who was ranked, what was he, 150-ish?
Yeah, he was in the top 150, I believe. But he was not towards the top.
He was maybe not out of position, but may have been out of position, not, especially for the situation. But he could use his athleticism to make up that play.
Close the ground, yeah.
He tries that. If he tries that, they run the same set. If University of Kentucky or Tennessee runs the same set, he's basically, his best result is fouling him. His best result. More than likely, by the time he gets in position, the ball's already dropped through the hoop, and they're already celebrating, moving back.
Yeah.
And that's just the speed with which the game is played, the physicality with which the game is played, the way that division, and it doesn't matter what level of college basketball you're on. When you're going from high school to college, I mean, I've had a teammate of theirs was telling me as a D3 player, you know what? I mean, guys don't miss at my level now. It used to be you kind of just, okay, you make a mistake, the guy's probably going to miss. You start playing college basketball and you leave a guy wide open, he's going to hit more times than not. And so players, I think, coming in have that same expectation we had when we were freshmen going to college, which is, hey, I'm here. Bloomington, open up to me.
Yeah.
The world is my oyster. I am 18 years old and I can take the planet over. Look at all the guys at Boise State, similar story. We're all going to take on the world. We're all going to be governor. So, you kind of go through this process of learning how to play on the collegiate level. So what does it match up? Does a coach's role and a player's role oftentimes match up? Oftentimes it doesn't. But so many times the best education for that freshman are those teammates.
Yeah.
And they're going up again practice and they're saying, okay, so, well, I was ranked higher than this player. Why is he eating my lunch? Why were we hearing Joey Brunk was eating Trace Jackson Davis's lunch all the time in practice? Because Trace Jackson Davis is still playing the game at a high school level. Yeah. Joey Brunk was playing at a Division I Power 5 level.
Yeah.
And so players have to learn how to play the game at this level. They have to learn also, and oftentimes for the first time in their lives, many of these players, and even in a situation at a Mount Verde, or an IMG, you may not be the best player on the court, but you're not but no one's really hands above better than you on the floor at that given time.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. If you're Malik Renew when you're 17 years old, there's nobody that's just head and shoulders above you in ability and skill. Now you may have that in Trace Jackson Davis on your own team.
Yeah.
And you've never had to practice this hard in your life. You've never had to work that hard.
Yeah. And you hear stories oftentimes of the times at which, at least, I'm sure you've heard these too, that the times in which elite players that go into college, when they're most depressed, it's typically the first weeks when they're first exposed to the current players. They come in, like you said, high expectations. I've been dominating everyone I've played against since I started playing this sport when I was, 3 or 4.
Diapers.
Now, for the first time, like just routinely on a daily basis, I'm getting the crap beat out of me. They're more physically mature. Yeah, maybe, if you're a high-rated recruit, let's say, yes, my athleticism is maybe better than theirs, but these guys are fully developed. And so I can't even jump above them because they're so much physically stronger than me that they're just like blocking me out. They just have me completely like locked down. And that's when those players oftentimes go back to their dorm room in tears. And you're right. And that's where the development kind of begins, is that, okay, what do you do after that? It's like, some of the kids develop, in terms of just getting more competitive, they hit the gym, they build up, they become strong themselves. And then all the advantages that they have over those other kids comes through, because now there's no longer a physicality variance. They're just as strong as those older kids. And now that they're 10, 15-inch vertical leap advantage over them now actually has some meaning.
Well, and also, like, they can't paper over the mistakes of their athleticism either. Like the experienced player can look at what they're doing and know, like, that guy knew what I was doing before I did it. Yeah, because he's seen a more polished player as athletic as you do that to them before, and now he knows how to counter it.
Yeah.
Another possibility. So I mean, again, we just lost Willie Mays since our last episode, and Willie Mays. You cannot have a list of the greatest players to ever play the game and not have Willie Mays at the top of it or damn near close to top of that list.
Yep.
You can make arguments, but Willie Mays may have been the most complete player to ever play the game, or at least the first player to do it the way that he did it.
Yeah.
That being said, Mike, do you want to take a wild stab as to how Willie Mays performed in his first 25, 26 at-bats?
Ooh.
How many hits?
I don't know the exact. I know it was not great, but I will say 3.
One for 26.
1 for 26. Wow.
He hit a single home run in his first 6 or 7 games, first 10 games or so.
Yeah,
and
that's bad. I just didn't know it was that.
and that's a learning curve. Now, Leo DeRocher, I believe, was a manager at the time, kind of walked him through that. He had Monty Irvin on that team as well that helped him. Mm-hmm. I think there were guys that helped him through that, but that's an extreme amount of self-doubt going in 20, 21, 22 years of age, and you're 1 for 26, and you're asking yourself the question, should I even be here? Mm-hmm. Some guys bounce back from that differently than others. I mean, we can obviously say Willie Mays bounced back from that in a way that is epic. But
I would say 24 All-Star seasons is a decent bounce back.
Yeah, 660 career home runs. It wasn't the first one. It was the other 659 that counted. Yeah. But it's one of those deals that I think it's important for us to realize that coming in, and we say this a lot, they're 18-year-old kids. And the 18-year-old me and the 49-year-old me, I'd like to think I'm a little wiser, a little more somber. Well, maybe not somber, but at the very least, I've at least figured some things out, which is the world's a much bigger place than what I could see in my own kind of purview. And I think I always respected the fact that when the game gets hard for a kid for the first time, you're going to have to kind of help that kid through. And I think oftentimes coaches, that's their primary job in working with their freshmen. Yeah. Helping them over that hurdle, helping them over those issues. And plus, for the first time, they're dealing with really truly living on their own. Even if they're going to a residential high school at some point, they're still the key word is high school, with all the temptations and all of the freedoms that are afforded to you at any Power 5 school, especially at a place like the University of Kentucky or Indiana University, where the basketball program is so high profile.
Exactly.
You're going to have some things thrown at you that you're going to have to kind of figure out, and you can get lost very easily in those types of environments. And we've seen that happen to freshmen across the country all the time. So,
I always say that, with freshmen and how people view them, I always would say that, coaches really do need to reassure them, right? Like you said, because the expectations are so tremendous on them. I mean, even with their families, I mean, it's like going back home. It's like, hey, you're killing it, in high school and junior high, how things going there. I saw you sit the bench again. Why aren't you getting into the game? There's all that noise going on back home when you have these kids, often, especially if they're kind of going away to a big school and they're coming back. And coaches really should just pull aside and say, look, kid, this is college basketball. This isn't Logan's Run. This is college basketball. You don't have to develop that quickly. We're not going to push you out the door so fast just because you don't get something going on within the first, 10, 15 games. So it is about, like you said, it's development, not just like the physical aspect, but the mental aspect is the making sure that you can keep the kids kind of zoned in on improvement and development, and making sure that they're just not getting so overwhelmed in the first weeks where you have like a Larry Bird situation where you have a great talent, but it's just not enough. And then you just get to the point where you can't take it anymore and you have to find an alternative. And and you literally hitchhike out the door.
Hitchhike back home. I'm doing my hitchhiker thumb right now. And that's, yeah, I think you've hit kind of the nail on the head, going back home and hearing those voices. Read Tony's book. There's
another plug.
Mom and Dad, Grandma and Grandpa, Uncle Billy, read Tony's book.
Yeah. Because
in reality, it's this whole thing of all of a sudden a parent has to look in the face that their kid is struggling. And look, when my kid is struggling to get up on the couch, I'm like, should I boost him? You're always, you've been there. You're there now.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, at some point it's a thing of, character revealing is many times what sports is. And if the first instinct is screaming at the coach.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, now that you are professionals, now that these guys are getting more money to come to these institutions to play, that's going to be an interesting dynamic too, that, mom and dad's approach to this is, look, you may be sitting the bench, but you're still getting X amount of money.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure anybody else is going to give that to you. And so getting good advice, the sort of, if you want to be treated like a professional, then get professional advice is kind of it would be my way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's a good point, because I always say that you can almost tell the variance of advice that kids are getting based upon their actions and behaviors when they arrive at a school. Even kids on the same team in the same class.
Yeah.
You'll see some kids, it's like, wow, that kid's just really professional, how they go about themselves, how they got yelled at by the coach, but they kind of knew, okay, I kind of screwed up here. And then the very same kid, or very same team, different kid, same class, under the same circumstances, just completely goes off the deep end. You think, okay, well, where are the adults in that kid's life? Who's telling him that he should be asking for more playing time when clearly he's not up to it at this point? So yeah, you're right. I'm always curious about what the channel of information is being fed into these kids from outside the court, basically outside the team, in terms of family and and peers and all that. And so, yeah, that's that I think playing time is always the sort of the hinge variable, right? That always seems to be, I'm sure NIL kind of adds a different
layer,
dynamic or layer exactly to the conversation today. But I think the easiest one is playing time. And recruits, that so often they want two big things at the same time that are often in conflict when they're coming into a school. One, they want to play as freshmen.
Right.
And two, they want to play at a school with high visibility and national attention. And the problem is, unless you are like an Anthony Davis type of player or Cody Zeller or whoever.
Zion Williamson.
Williamson, yeah. Unless you're one of those kids, the chances of you fulfilling both of those expectations are very low as a freshman. And so it gets into that conversation we had in the prior episode. If you are a fringe, 100 type player in high school, what is the best route for you?
Yeah.
Should you go to Arizona where you'll sit the bench, or should you go to New Mexico and possibly start? Ball out for a year or two, and then possibly get a starting job at Arizona by your junior year. Now the portal is there.
Or take a look at, Galen brought this up. And by the way, if you haven't listened to Galen's 3-pod episode on Crimson Cast about NIL, I highly recommend
it. Yeah.
But he talked at the end of the third one a little bit about the idea of, and I mean, I think and off air, you and I have definitely kicked this around. Several of us have kicked this around. If I'm sitting at Indiana State, would it make sense for me to create a covenant with Bloomington?
Like a minor league system?
Yeah. Like you go ahead and you spend your freshman or sophomore years in Terre Haute. And maybe during those freshman and sophomore years, you develop, you play in the Valley, you pick up, and not all of you are going to make it to Bloomington, but you get a preference, and you could do it through NIL cooperatives or whatever. But whether it's Indiana State, whether it's Ball State, I mean, those of you reading the Peaks board know what I'm talking about with that. Again, strongly recommend looking at that thread from Mike Lewis. I don't think an IU Indy would be necessarily a good fit, or a U Indy going D2 or even Horizon League, but definitely kind of that sort of Division I high, if you're Division I football playoff, higher level schools, you start looking at maybe that option and you start thinking about it more. And I also think it helps temper fan expectations a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I think you and I both have been through this enough, and we know what that looks like.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Help is on the way was not meant to describe what was going to happen in 3 years. It was about next year.
Exactly. The immediacy is always the problem, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You ever notice like teams with strong, stable rosters don't have that raging fan need for their freshmen to play like All-Americans right away, right?
Nope.
It's only when your roster has like, some kind of glaring hole is where the fans are just determined to have their freshmen like ball out as soon as they arrive on campus.
Well,
it's kind of like, you think about it, like two scenarios I was thinking of in preparing for this was when you think of like freshman hype, there's Damon Bailey on one end and Romeo Langford on the other.
Yeah.
One scenario is governed by, gleeful anticipation, and the other one is governed by, flop sweat panic out of complete necessity. It's like the difference between, boy, I can't wait till this kid arrives and, see what he contribute versus, dear God, we need this kid to like Sherpa haul the entire backcourt for the next, 12 months.
Yeah,
exactly. So it is crazy just like how this whole expectations, is kind of developed. And I think, you and I've talked about this before. I don't think there's ever like a singular point which you can say, oh, well, this is where it started. But I think there's at least a buildup, I think really seemed to come to a crescendo about around the early 1990s when it came to like freshman expectations. I think about the Fab Five coming into Michigan. Right. And around that time, sort of like ESPN was really picking up. The McDonald's All-American game started getting broadcast, more readily. A lot of the magazines, recruit magazines started like picking up steam. Dick Vitale, of course, was becoming much more popular, and his focus on the diaper dandies. And so all of that, I think, like the media kind of, I think, spun fans up in a way that maybe just hadn't happened, the prior years.
Well, 5-star was happening at that. I mean, 5-star was really taking off at that time too.
Yeah.
5-star, when you start thinking about nationalized basketball camps.
Yeah. ABCD night camp. Yeah, exactly.
Right. All of those are happening. And again, the shoe, I think you brought up a good point, bringing the apparel companies into it. That became a big kind of like, okay, now, these guys are looking for the next Jordan. That was always kind of the story. In reality, they knew that they had to get their brand out there because you're going to sell more shoes.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, this is something when we're talking about this now, I think you and I were both aware of this, but a lot of fans, I think, don't even realize that freshmen, they weren't always even allowed to play varsity.
No.
It was almost like, colleges were almost like high school back in the day. They literally had like the version of a JV team. They called it like the freshman team.
Yep.
And so it was only after, say, it was 1972, the NCAA passed a rule that allowed freshmen to actually start playing varsity games. Because before, I mean, the freshman teams pre-1972 used to play each other the way I think manager team
do it today.
Managers on teams now play against each other, from different schools. So it's almost like that. But it's funny. It did lead to some funny scenarios back in those early days. In 1965, the UCLA freshman team pulverized the number one UCLA varsity team in a preseason scrimmage. It was actually the first game. I think it was like the first, I guess, like technically sanctioned game that was played at the newly constructed Pauley Pavilion. So it was literally like the first time the Pauley Pavilion was used. Was in that for that like scrimmage game. Now, the primary reason that the freshmen obliterated the varsity is because the freshman team had a 7'2" freshman named Blue Alcindor that had come in, and he, I think, AKA Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, had 31 points, I believe.
He was a really good airline pilot too, wasn't he?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, he's karate master. He's been so many different things in his life, hasn't he?
You tell your old man to drag Walton and Lanier up and down the court for 48 minutes and see how.
Great scene. The UCLA starting center that year was a 6'7" guy named Doug McIntosh, and Kareem Alcindor at 7'2", just completely dominating. I think Lucius Allen was also on that freshman team, so that had some help. But
adds a little bit of
Yeah, exactly. But again, that was sort of the reality before you actually had freshmen playing. Is that you like all college basketball was just sophomores, juniors, and seniors, and so you do have this kind of media problem, or let's say a media focus that creates a problem in terms of perception with the fans. Which is, you kind of think of it almost as like a weird Pareto issue, is where if 99% of the media attention is on just 1% of the top freshmen, it's going to create a completely distorted reality in terms of what good freshman players look like. You think about even like when we're talking about the Fab Five, I remember when Jimmy King was a top 20 recruit, he was not producing nearly as much as, say, Rose and Weber. And people had asked, what's wrong with Jimmy King? I said, well, nothing's wrong with him. He's scoring like 9 points a game. That's what most like top end freshmen play like. The guys that are oddities, the weird ones are Weber and Rose.
Right.
Those are the guys that are like abnormal in terms of like, freshman output. So yeah, it's interesting how I think, and I don't think it was intentional. I think just look, the media wants to focus on the things that, produce fan interest, and new high-end freshmen are sort of like the glittery new thing that you can like focus on from the media standpoint that get people to watch. But the problem is that over time, I think it's just developed this false sense of exactly what a good freshman looks like in terms of their performance.
Well, and don't you also think, like, from a fan standpoint, like, how much time do we really spend, and you and I in particular, and let's talk about most of our basketball friend circle. How much time do we actually spend talking about recruiting on a percentage basis?
Ooh, a ton. I mean,
80. Is it 80-20?
Well, north of 3/4. Yeah, it would be at least 80%.
I mean, and we spent. I mean, we just got out of another big recruiting weekend, another big visit weekend with the Charlie Hughes going up and up in Westfield Carmel area, and everybody, and everybody's out. Everybody, you're seeing private planes taking coaches to watch multiple games in a day. All of this sort of stuff, where all the hoopla, all of the investment, all of the time investment, and the conversation investments on the internet, really on the internet, and whether it's, you're sitting on a message board, whether you're sitting on YouTube, you can queue up a clip of 50 different outlets that is showing what Kyan Anthony did this weekend.
Yeah.
And so obviously, clearly prioritization, if it's being prioritized here, whoever gets Kyan Anthony is going to knock. If Tristan Newton's playing, he better watch his back. Kyan Anthony's going to eat his lunch.
Yeah. Exactly.
There's always that mindset that the next guy is going to come in and take it over.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember, I think I remember the first really hyped recruiting battle that I remember is, and I think we were talking about this earlier, Eric Montrose.
Yeah.
We had Bailey locked in at Indiana.
Yeah.
Henderson's coming next. They'll get, they get Glenn, we get Allen.
Yeah.
But Eric Montrose, what does that group need? They need a top 50 center. Didn't mind that, because Lawrence Funderburk and Chris Lawson both left.
Yeah.
What they're missing is a center. And we got one right there at Lawrence North. And Todd Leary's on that team. I mean, you go through this and pre-internet, it was so bad that when Montrose decided to go to Carolina, when he plays at the Hoosier Dome in the McDonald's All-American game, he gets booed in his hometown.
Yeah.
This is nothing new, is what I'm saying. And it wasn't like Montrose came in and was like National Player of the Year his freshman year, I might add. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, he was decent, but he was a decent freshman year. But he was. It isn't funny how many like storylines there are in that. So like Montrose was there, and Leary, was kind of brought in. Of course, there's always a theory that they brought Leary in to see if they could, hook Montrose in on that. Do you remember what the other scholarship offer that was kind of being mulled around that time, around that
was
class?
It Matt Painter?
It was Matt Painter.
It was Matt Painter. Yeah. It's like time is
interesting alternative histories, that and believe me, I remember Matt Painter used to hang out at the Knight household and was of all the kids in that recruiting class that was most pro IU by far was by Matt Painter. Knowing the history of where he came from and his family and all that. So
there's got to be some sort of almost like Shakespearean sort of thing, a drama that could be written about the castaways, all these individuals that were kind of, you're not welcome here. You're not welcome here in Shangri-La. So we're going to create our own Shangri-La with the Triple X root beer stand and cows in the field, and and we're going to obsess ourselves with beating you every single time we look at you. Well, the other guys are like, are they still up there? Are they still up there? Oh, I guess they made a Final Four this year. Whoa, well, good for them. It's like, yeah, you know what I mean? It's like kind of crazy how that goes.
Yeah.
But no, I think that. It is. And I think as we kind of talk, again, we talk about the fan expectations, though. It's like, there's a lot. I do think how would you categorize the talk about recruiting over?
What's that?
How would you categorize conversations about programs recruiting over guys? Like, how do you kind of look at that? Yeah, because I know that's a big conversation we have a lot about freshman expectations.
I think the whole recruiting over thing was something that was much more prominent in the past, just because it was almost like I used to compare recruiting and players staying at schools almost like United Auto Workers. It was like a union.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I've got this scholarship. This is my slot, and by the time I'm a junior, I'm guaranteed seniority preference. And I think that's the way it used to work. But now, especially with the portal now, it's just that whole stream of playing, at one school from freshman year to senior year is just being cut off on so many levels. I mean, I was doing the numbers in terms of looking at top 100 recruits, 10, 20 years ago, staying at their school versus now. It's wild. You look at go on the RSCI and just look down and they will list all the schools that the kid is. So number one recruit, Rasheed Wallace, North Carolina, whatever. And it would list what school they're at. Back then you would see just maybe a small handful of kids that would have 2 entries in there. Mm-hmm. Now it is rare if you see a kid, let's say below a certain, that's not a one and done kid. It's rare to see one that's just has one school listed. It's much more often you're seeing 2 schools listed. And it's going to get worse as time goes. When I say worse, is going to adapt much more into a more fluid and flexible environment for kids moving back and forth.
I think for fans' expectation, it's good to know that this is a two-way street, that sometimes coaches call the kid in and be like, okay, look, maybe you have a better opportunity somewhere else. Coaching changes make a big difference on this too. Yeah. But that is that conversation that I think needs to be had with parents, with kids throwing a freshman temper tantrum is probably not going to help you in the long run.
Yeah.
Or the short run, because if you're not playing, here's your question. If you're not playing at North or at Southwest Nebraska Teachers and Barber College,
mm-hmm.
there's a good chance that you're not going to get that offer from Kansas next week.
Yeah.
And expect to just be inserted into the starting lineup.
Yep.
So
I've always said I think there should be a consultancy out there. I've even offered my own services to people I know, saying, look, one of the hardest things in dealing, and this kind of like maybe dovetails with what Tony's trying to address in his book. It's like, look, one of the hardest problems is like telling parents that their kids aren't really as good as they think they are. Mm-hmm. What if we just hired consultants that would go to teams and they would serve as nothing but the deliverer of bad news to parents for the sake of the school and the coach? Like, if you're a coach, I mean, think about how great that is. Like, you can sort of outsource all of that conversation. It's like human resources. I mean, I'm an HR guy. Yeah. Exactly that. I'm so used to that conversation. I could easily have that conversation with parents about their kids, their playing skills for the sake of the team and the coach, avoiding all of that, outright.
Right. I mean, I've had the conversation you dread. Parent walks up. What will it take for my kid to get more meaningful minutes? He needs to be a year older,
Year older, 3 inches taller, 10 inches added to the vertical leap.
That's actually part of sometimes it's like, look, physically, he's playing at the level he needs to be playing at.
Yeah.
Okay, look, you want me to, you're diplomatic about it. You're nice about it. But at the same time, you don't want to discourage the kid, but it's like, he needs to keep working at getting quicker, getting this, getting that. But honestly, I've had that conversation. He's a fifth grader playing in a 5th and 6th grade league. Yep. He's got 4 other guys ahead of him that are kind of in these spots.
Yep.
Needs to get a year older.
Exactly. So I think we've done a good job explaining sort of the expectations, especially from the players' side, the coaches' side. I think what we can get to next, and once we get into segment 2, we'll discuss sort of like what does an actual freshman typically look like? What are sort of the high end and low end expectations? So in segment 2, once we get back, we'll discuss what does a failed freshman look like? What does a successful freshman look like? So we'll have all that coming next on X's and Joes. Yeah,
welcome back.
I'll take this one, Bob.
You can take this one.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome back to X's and Joes. I'm Mike Greenwood, joined by Coach Bob Moats. We're going to jump into segment 2 here. We're going to discuss freshman performance. Like, what does the actual numbers say about what freshmen produce when they come into college? And I thought an interesting way to sort of frame this in terms of the discussing what we think is like typically the most common sort of outcome for freshmen. I would point out the recent NBA Finals as a good example here. Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown were probably the 2 most pivotal players in delivering the Celtics their 18th World Championship just this last week. Now, both Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown were 5-star recruits coming out of high school. Now, even despite that, they were not clearly poised to become the kind of players that you see today. You do not look at Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum and think, wow, those guys are going to be like, NBA All-Stars by the time they get up. They're both, athletic. They were both obviously tall, pretty skilled, but still very skinny and not really productive at that time. Jason Tatum was actually the 4th best player on that 2017 Duke team. I think, he was a good player. He's, a 7 BPM. Of course, most Duke players are usually at least, north of 5, no matter what. But Luke Kennard, Grayson Allen, I think Emile Jefferson, they were all considered like the above him in terms of the pecking order on that Duke team. And that Duke team wasn't like one of the best Duke teams either. I mean, they lost to South Carolina in the 2nd round. And so they're definitely not one of the the more championship caliber teams that they had. Jaylen Brown played at a decent but not great team at Cal. I think he was a 3.6 box plus minus. And, that team was bounced out of the first round by Hawaii in the NCAA tournament. So again, these are two of the best players in the world right now. And when they came in as freshmen, they were not nearly what you would think of as, two of the greatest players in the world. And so I think, kind of dovetailing to what Bob was saying previously, development is a key variable here. You just don't know, unless you're talking about like an Anthony Davis or a LeBron James. You don't know exactly which one of those guys is going to rise above literally everyone over the course of their, between the ages of like 18 to 23 to become like an NBA superstar.
Well, when we talk about this, are we also not talking about the fact that we're looking at players further down the pipeline?
Yeah.
That when you really think about this, that what we're talking about is, okay, so you're crossing the Sinai with Moses and the children.
Mm-hmm.
You may get lost for about 40 years, or you may get lost for a period of time, that it's going to be a thing where, I go back to Lawrence of Arabia on that one, where it's like, well, Moses did. Well, yeah, but he was blessed by God. You're just a guy with two dudes. I mean, can you not maybe compare yourself to a prophet?
We need to have a David Lean episode one day, just David Lean movies all the way through.
we'll start with Kwai and we'll go all the way through Passage to India, and we'll skip Ryan's Daughter just because I can't do a whole lot of Bob Mitchum, unless Bob Mitchum, although he did really well in that movie, but seriously, it's like we're talking about guys that these are Jason Tatum's not a baby anymore.
And these they're obviously, you can just tell even like it's the physicality of them is that what you see now in these players is not what they were. And so I think that's an interesting way to get people to sort of like, focus on like, okay, what is reasonable for freshmen? Because freshmen do not look like, the Jason Tatum of now is not the Jason Tatum of when he was a freshman. So you also have to kind of like do that the other way. The freshmen you see now that you may be criticizing and saying, oh, why aren't they producing more? Why is this kid just not able to adapt to the game? That kid may be something totally different 3, 4, 5 years down the road. So that's kind of the point of the the expectation setting part of this, this podcast. So one thing I want to start out with maybe is to we'll jump into some examples. We're going to discuss some of the numbers and just give you a little bit of heads up. Bob and I both spent like last few weeks just sort of like combing through Sports Reference and some other sources to get a sense of some of the averages that you see in terms of freshman performance and performance as, they become sophomores, juniors, and seniors. That's kind of stuff I've been doing, for a few years, like going back, but every like few years, I kind of jump back in and do like one more data run to see like, okay, has anything changed from 5, 6 years ago? And luckily for the most part, a lot of stuff still seems to be holding consistent, maybe a few bumps, like Bob said, with hiccups with box plus minus with freshmen. But for the most part, the trends, I guess, are still sort of pointed the same direction. So we talk about fans and how they analyze players. One of the first things they always kind of think about is like, okay, where is this? Is this guy doing what I hoped he would do? Is he doing exactly what was expected? And so if you run the actual numbers of the typical players based upon their rankings, and this is something I will typically do, I will look at the national rankings of the high school players, and I will put them all in, let's say, one discrete group. So I'll put all the top 10 kids in one Excel file, the 10 or the 20 through 50 kids in another. And so I'll just like split all these out and try to come up with like some numbers that demonstrate like, okay, when these other kids come in later on, are they at the level of the kids that came before them at that ranking? Are they above? Are they below? So I usually do this kind of analysis like typically. So I wanted to kind of run that through some examples, recent examples, and also maybe more familiar examples to kind of demonstrate this. So the one I started out with here is Romeo Langford. Everyone remembers when Romeo Langford came through, obviously the hype that, was surrounding his recruitment to Indiana. He had How would you assess his season, Bob? Or let's put it this way. How would you say the reaction to Romeo Langford's freshman season was within, say, the IU message board network?
I think that there was, and I think all of us that remember 5 years back remember that there were voices that were constantly expressing disappointment in what was transpiring, and we're putting a great deal at the feet of Langford as a freshman, even though he was performing at what we would say was a very high rate. But again, it goes back down to the fan expectations where, I mean, you and I even had the conversation when Romeo came in, was that, now that Langford's here with what IU has already on the roster, it's a potential Sweet 16 team that when you really think about it, they get some things figured out and they work together and they kind of get everything kind of firing on the cylinders they need to. They can be very competitive in the Big Ten. This is a better roster than what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 seasons, or at least the last 2 years, to say the least. Let me rephrase that, because I'm kind of misspeaking the whole Thomas Bryant and Jalen Blackman stuff. But this was a roster that when you're saying a year 2, assuming that the recruiting stays up with year 3, it was a good going into your second year haul for Archie Miller. And again, was a team that, again, when we talked about that group, it's like, well, you could definitely see them being a second weekend team if certain things fall a certain way.
Right.
It wasn't expected to lose 14 to 15 games, by the way.
Yeah. Exactly. And do you think that a lot of that is the problem of sort of like the savior complex, is that the player may be performing well individually, but if their performance is not just pulling the whole team up along with them, then the performance, the individual performance, almost gets like judged based upon that. It's like, well, who cares if you're performing well? You're not, like I said, you're not Sherpa dragging the rest of the team up with you to the top of the mountain.
Right. I mean, and we can go back all the way back to Andre Patterson, or I would say Jason Collier and Luke Recker would probably be the better choices on this one. But that era and that help us on the way mindset, which is, well, why? Obviously, the problem, you didn't fix the problem. Well, you're putting that on an 18-year-old kid to fix a problem that clearly is something that's more ingrained in an overall roster construction or schematic issue. Exactly. So that's where I go with that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because you think about it, the players that are coming through, if just in terms of statistics. In this example, I have Romeo Langford. He had 6.5 box plus minus. He's about 16.5 points a game. I mean, even as a senior, that's really good.
That's a great number.
That's a great number. And doing that as a freshman. And
what do you think, 75 points a game? Yeah.
And a freshman that was oftentimes being doubled. And, being like, obviously, like, Juwan Morgan was kind of like, the alpha on that team in terms of a lot of the attention. But Romeo was definitely not forgotten in terms of the scouting report for the other team. And like you said, the attention that he got for not, let's say, pulling the team up, by its by its hair is really remarkable. But if you analyze the actual numbers in terms of like where Romeo fits relative to his peers that came in terms of the rankings, he's above where he should be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's 4 points above the scoring average for top 10 players in the year he played. And he's about 0.7 above the box plus minus average for the kids in that rating category. So he's above. So where's the problem? And so it kind of does kind of go back to the question of like, okay, well, what are people expecting in terms of, what do people think the average freshman looks like in terms of like a top rated kid? And so again, getting back to the media question and the question of like, okay, is there just too much attention on those outlier players that are playing, let's say, like the Anthony Davis level type of dudes? Is that creating a sense of people like, well, that's what a freshman phenom should look like? It should be a kid that's like a 10 box plus minus and above, and basically leading a team to a national championship.
If you saw a Devontae Green or an Al Durham with a similar, or just, with similar BPM numbers, along with what Juwan Morgan did that year, you'd have a much better team.
Yeah.
And that's the other part of it too, which is, when we talk about that 2019 season, it always felt like they were playing so reactively, almost so scriptedly. And, schematically, like we always talk, one of the things we always talk about, why the hell didn't they put Langford and Morgan in 2-man game?
Yeah.
On one side of the floor, run some empty side concepts, or run even that was even at that point in time. There was just seeming to be a lot. They were so mechanical in that era that, there's a reason if they had played a little more free and a little more open, Langford's numbers would have looked really good, because you would have had other players that were contributing in a more consistent manner.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's the question of your teammates, obviously. There's a very strong correlation, obviously, between having equally talented teammates that are drawing off defensive attention from you and your own performance. If you think about the 93 team, I mean, if Greg Graham just came in and he was like the only good player on that class, he would not have been nearly as good as he turned out to be if he didn't have, Chaney and Henderson, all those other, guys around him. And so that goes across, all of college basketball. So I'm always very attuned to worry about those kids that are coming in that are having the savior crown kind of placed upon them, that don't have a lot of support around them. Because that really, like, oh man, that poor kid was like, does not have the help that's necessary to really meet the fans' expectations, and man, everything's just going to fall on that kid's shoulders.
But you also could argue, I mean, they had the help. I mean, they had a decent enough core around Romeo Langford that a lot of it came down to coaches having to figure out how to play that kid inside a scheme or a system. Mm-hmm. And by the time the season got to a close, they were playing decent basketball, but getting there. And oftentimes you find with freshmen, when you over rely on freshmen, it just takes longer to get there, because as you're learning to use them, they're learning how to play the game. And it wasn't just Langford; it was everybody learning how to play with the kid and putting everything together, which is where it goes back to what Miyako was talking about with continuity.
Yeah,
that you have to, having some continuity is a good thing. Yeah. But you take the inverse of that, you put Reed Sheppard up there, which I love the fact you put Reed Sheppard's BPM up there, because when I first saw that, I about fell out of my chair.
He's one. He's another one to highlight, just because he kind of falls, I think, in also with some help, obviously, from having a pretty strong team around him, but also what was interesting about Reed Sheppard, he's at 11.4 box plus minus and 12.5 points a game. He really, within that class, was not necessarily the top recruit. He was, he's I think he was in the 30s in terms of his rankings. He was like between 30 and 50. But he obviously just had a crazy good year. He had one of the best shooting years a freshman has had, like, in quite a while, like decades almost, in terms of at that level, on a nationally relevant team. So yeah, scoring average, it's like 6.5 above 30 through 50 scoring average recruits, and then BPM is 8.8 above, which is crazy. But the interesting thing I thought about Reed Sheppard, and maybe this kind of like goes back to our conversation about like the expectations. Remember Bradshaw, that was on the same Kentucky team. He was a much higher rated recruit when he was coming in. And I remember in the preseason mags and everything is like, oh man, Bradshaw's, coming to Kentucky. And there wasn't, Sheppard got some attention because, Dillingham was also there. I mean, he was kind of like a little bit at the back of the line in terms of the attention he was getting. Then the first few games happen and he starts going crazy. The camera basically moved away from Bradshaw and started focusing in on Reed Sheppard over time. And that's one thing you kind of notice, like, even in the IU example, is like you go back to like the 89 class, same thing. Remember, who was the top recruits in that 89 class in IU not in terms of like, forget rankings, who was people paying attention to in that recruiting class?
Well, Pat Graham was the 89 Mr. Basketball.
Yeah. And who are the other McDonald's All-Americans on that
You show that one off here because you're jumping me back to a point where I was skinny too.
So the 3 top rated recruits on that 89 Indiana class would have been Lawrence Funderburk, Greg Graham, and Pat Graham.
Okay.
Now Calbert Chaney was 4th in line. Chaney was like considered like a kind of 50-ish, like
didn't he break his leg though at Harrison his senior year?
He messed up his ankle.
Broken leg. I think it was something like that. It was a lower body.
Yeah, he had a lower body issue that
he was in a boot. He was in a boot.
That's when we knew he would become an IU guy.
Yeah, totally.
So Chaney was not, sort of the top recruit in terms of focus when he was coming in. Now, I remember they had the Cream and Crimson game.
Yeah.
And he really played well at that. And then the first game, I think, was against like Miami of Ohio, and he scored like 20.
Yeah.
And that just started like the ball rolling. I remember, and again, it's like the camera just like shifted. It's like, oh, that kid, look at that kid over there. And so thereafter, it was the Chaney show. And I went to this game. It was the Kentucky IU game in 1990. And it was, this is when that team was all freshmen. I went on Galen's YouTube page, found the game, and watched the broadcast. The first guy they mentioned for the IU team was Calbert Chaney, where just weeks before he was like 4th in line in terms of attention on the freshman class, not just the team, but just like the freshman class. He's the first guy mentioned overall on the whole team, including like Eric Anderson and other like older dudes. So again, it's the interesting, like, facet when we're talking about this. It's not just performance. It's also like, how the perception gets molded by the kid playing well, and then everyone's attention kind of moving towards where the performance is taking place.
Well, and Cal moved away from, and we talked about this several times this season, was Cal moved away from his usual model of overplaying of really playing his bigs, giving his bigs too great a role offensively. Not to say that Bradshaw didn't play a role. He did. But, he had Reeves, he had Dillingham, and then Reed Shepherd. It's hard to guard all 3 of them. But end of the day, they ended up being bounced by, was it Oakland City or Oakland?
Yeah. Oakland. Yeah.
And it's like, there's a reason why Cal is sitting down in Fayetteville now, and Mark Pope is now back home. But, it's like when you kind of look at Shepherd, those outliers do have some interesting stories. Like you can make the same story for Trae Young, although he had an insane utilization rate. He had a really high BPM when he played for Oklahoma, ended up playing himself into a one and done situation.
Sure.
But I think Shepherd, it was almost like because he had Reed Shepherd, Calipari was able to change what he was doing offensively.
Yeah.
More so than he ever been able to do over the last probably decade, I would say.
Yep. No, totally. And I think it does depend so much on like where those kids go. I mean, just like, I wish there was much better, let's say, consulting taking place for some of these kids in terms of like where they're choosing to go to school, because again, I think there's a bias a lot of kids are having in terms of going for the name.
Right.
Like, I want to be, I want my name to be associated with this big school, because if I go to a school that doesn't have as much swag or, attention, then does that reflect on me? And when the fact is, like, look at all the schools that are producing NBA players now, and look at where you can transfer in. You can just completely go wherever you want. So as freshmen, it's like, you shouldn't be worrying about that. Just go to a place that's going to give you as much playing time and development as possible. And then once you become, once you put up some good numbers, maybe Kentucky, UConn, or whoever is going to come calling.
Right.
Yeah. And this example here, so we kind of discussed, a few of the kids on the upside of the, let's say, the trend line in terms of over or underperforming. Some examples maybe of kids that are prominent that at least we're aware of, in Big Ten country. Probably the one that I think Indiana fans might be very aware of is Xavier Booker at Michigan State. I think of him, Indiana high school kid, came out. I would say, I think you would agree, there was some split opinion about Xavier Booker's placement as a top 20 recruit. Not always say it was necessarily within our friend group, but I think even just nationally, he's one of those kids that just a lot of people looked at and said, man, look how high that ceiling is. And other people looked at and said, look how low that floor is.
COVID really kind of did some things to the rankings. I think Booker is a good example of what that was. I think the question was legitimate. If he's not playing for Jason Delaney, how can he play? If he's not finding floor time with Jason Delaney, how is he not finding it with Tom Izzo? That was kind of the question. And it was a legit question. Now, not to, but again, I think the numbers up there pretty much show what we know.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's 3.9 box plus minus, and he's about.
Is it bad?
What's that?
Which isn't bad, by the way.
It's not bad. It's not bad. Yeah, his rates aren't bad. And he's at like just a little under 4 points a game. But he is technically below where you expect someone his ranking in terms of his his peer group.
He also was very low utilization, if I recall.
Yeah, I mean, they brought him off the bench, and the funny thing is they bring him in to shoot threes here and there. he's like the zone breaker for Michigan State. They bring in the 7 foot to start pumping threes up. So yeah, he's one of those interesting players that, and this is something I always tell people in terms of like, being a little bit more sympathetic to the rankers, because it is so hard, because some of these kids, some of them, their ceilings are so out of whack with their floors, and you're comparing kids, across the line. It's like, well, this kid is here in terms of where he is right now, but he's not going to get any better than this. This is as good as he's going to get. So where I rate him relative to this other kid who's like down here right now, who's like, below him, but his ceiling is way up here. And he's like maybe starting to move. I've watched him over the course of the last like 3 or 4 months, and he's really starting to move. It's like, well, it's like taking a snapshot of a race in the middle where one car is about to pass the other. You can take a snapshot and say, oh, look, car A is behind car B. But 5 seconds later, car A is zooming past, car B. And so did the photo lie? It's like, well, no, it didn't. It gave you a realistic assessment of what was taking place at that time, but it's all dynamic and it's moving constantly. Same thing with rankings. It's that, or players moving up and down the rankings. It's just that this performance is just constantly changing, and especially with like summer leagues and things like that. So the Xavier Booker story is like one example that sort of highlights that problem, is that, you have these kids that are just hard to rate. And so, yeah, a lot of them come through and don't necessarily produce a lot. Now, maybe he has a really great sophomore, junior, senior trajectory and things change, but people should not be surprised that Xavier Booker's having some issues, because it's not relative to Xavier Booker himself necessarily. It's just a lot of kids that are in that category have this kind of outcome.
Well, and bigs take a little bit of time to develop too. That's the other thing. I mean, and that's another thing where it's like he's learning how to play the college game. We talked, talking about that. You may see him next year take an incremental step up. Now, if he doesn't, the question is what happens going into his junior year. But I think in a situation like Booker, with the utilization he was at and the BPM, with his BPM and all of his metrics kind of looking at that, if it depends, a lot's going to depend on those first 12 or so games you see going into next year does he start moving towards his ceiling, or does he plateau at a certain level while being in East Lansing? Because I think once you get past your sophomore year and you haven't shown movement to that, to that ceiling. Yeah. In the portal era, it's a different ball game. I'll just put it that way.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and of course statistically, the biggest jump typically is freshman to sophomore year. So, and coaches are aware of that as well. So they're kind of looking at those kids very critically in that time windows, analyzing, okay, which of these kids are really like hitting the gas pedal on their development, and who looks like they're just hitting the brake and pulling the emergency brake at the same time.
Right.
Yeah. And speaking of that, in terms of like looking at some of these examples, one thing that always surprises people when we talk about, let's say, kids that are ranked in the top 100, realize that, especially as freshmen, how many of these kids not only are not performing even like just up to like even an average, but performing well below any sort of like standard average. And the example I pulled here is Zeb Jackson, who's a kid. I think IU took a look at him. He was a sort of Midwest recruit. Committed to Michigan. He had a negative 8.5 box plus minus. Now, that is obviously well below the national average. And he averaged 1 point a game his freshman year at Michigan. People would be surprised how many like top end recruits actually have a negative box plus minus their first year. Out of the top 100 recruits in any typical year, about a quarter of them will be underwater in terms of box plus minus. It'll be less than zero. So it sort of demonstrates sort of the problem of the variance you get with these kids, especially as freshmen, is that, not only a lot of them are just not going to be up to speed, they're going to be like, some are going to be well below the water line. And,
right.
And for some of them, especially in this portal era, that's a very quick invitation to take a look for another school. Zeb Jackson, I believe, went to Vandy. He did not last at Michigan. He bolted out there pretty quickly thereafter. So, and this is pretty typical. And the reason we're sort of using these examples is that each one of these kids kind of represents like a different type of kid that I see in the ranks, over the years, is that these kids will typically follow just like a certain, let's say, a certain number of preset paths that are pretty common for recruits. And that's one of them. This is like, unfortunately, it's sort of like the worst outcome for a kid is comes in completely overwhelmed, can't get minutes. When he does get minutes, is just performing pretty poorly, not scoring, turning the ball over a lot, can't defend anyone, and eventually bounces out of the school.
To put Zeb into perspective, he played 16 games his freshman year at 85 minutes.
Yeah.
Which is really, really low. He played
not a lot. Yeah.
His sophomore year, which was the year, right? It was kind of that was the 2022 season, which was the year after basketball without fans. Yeah. He played in 4 games for 35 minutes.
Yeah. So he actually was going down.
Yeah. And so basically at that point, I think Howard and the coaching staff said, you're probably not a fit for our program.
Yeah.
And that's, that is one of those things where, is it a fail for a freshman? Because he ends up, I think his final BPM, it was VCU, by the way, was 3.8. 3.8 at VCU. And by that point he was playing, he played 30, he started 35 out of 36 games and played over 1,000 minutes.
Yeah.
So still not a bad college career, honestly.
Exactly. And that's sort of the point of like, when we talk about sort of the progression, like so much of the conversation that, you and I had about the sweet spot was just that, is that, well, why do you have such a focus on these kids that are not sort of, let's say the one and dones? It's not that the one and done kids are bad. It's the problem is that they're too good, is that they bolt out of school before they develop. It's those other kids that stay in college, develop over time, and they're not relied on when they are freshmen or sophomores. It's the ones that become juniors and seniors and have the normal sort of like uptick progression in their development to become, the 6, 7, 8, 9 box plus minus kind of players. And so, you can have a kid that technically fails as a freshman that actually starts to thrive somewhere else as a junior and senior.
And even inside their own programs, like, if you start one for 26 and you end up going to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we look at how that progression actually looks, I know that we
So when we see if I can pull this up. There we go. Sorry. So, and the slides that we're going through here, and obviously, for our listening only followers, we will be posting all this obviously on in the show notes after the broadcast. So typically, the 4-year players that I tracked in this data poll for 2019 and 2023 classes, I was trying to get a sense of like, okay, what was their progression like? In terms of like, how they were kind of going through the program at the time. And so in this case, looking just at the rankings for the kids, let's say 1 through 10, 11 through 20, 30 through 50, 80 through 100, you see just the variance in terms of like the box plus minus output and the points per game for the players, and how they varied based upon the ranking. So I was happy to see, I guess, that the rankings still do have some validity. For 1 through 10 kids and the rankings, they're at 5.8 and 12.3 points per game. Again, these are the numbers I used to compare for the prior slide where we talk about like Romeo Langford. So Romeo obviously was just above this line. And so this kind of gives you a sense of the progression, is that, when you're looking at kids when they're coming in, this is where I say where the rankings have some validity, is that aggregately, you can see where the correlation exists in terms of the performance related to where the kids are ranked. When a kid comes in and let's say they're like, 80 through 100 player, you shouldn't be comparing them to a kid that's ranked, let's say in the 20s and have exactly the same expectations. Now, there can be like individual things about them that maybe you think that can be advantageous, but for the most part, when you're looking at the recruits, you should be kind of, let's say, indexing them relative to where they are ranked compared to their peers. Because again, as you see this progression here, it goes from box plus minus for 1 through 10 kids, 5.8, 11 through 20 goes to 4.4, 30 through 50 down to 2.6, and 80 through 100 it's down to 1.6. And the further you go, even past top 100, you start getting closer to basically 0, and then you start getting the negatives. Same thing, if you look at the if you're looking at say the progression of players that are 4-year top 100 kids in this data set, the box plus minus for them goes up as they go. So year 1 for the kids, these aren't just for all the top 100. This is the top 100 kids that stayed 4 years. They went from 1.4 their freshman year to 2.6 year 2, box plus minus, year 3, 2.8, and by year 4, they're at a 3.6. So again, a steady upward progression in terms of their output. And again, if you look throughout any time, like going back, and this is something, again, I've been doing for like, 20 plus years, this is typically what you see. You see like a steady incremental progression of, upward mobility for players as they move from freshman to sophomore to junior to senior. Now, the little trick is that this is the aggregate numbers. It is very rare for kids to actually have a sequence where their freshman year is better than their sophomore is better than junior, and junior is better than senior. Only about, I was checking this in this data set I was running, I think, it was 90% of kids in the set had a better senior year than their freshman year, which is what you typically see. So 90% of people are improving.
Right.
But only about 12% of the players had a steady upward progression. Where again, it was like where every year that they're in was better than the year prior, which means that 88% of the kids, all of them had at least one regression year in their 4 years.
Right.
So again, when we're talking about, fan expectations, like one thing I'm always reminding people is that if you see a kid that's having an off year and you're freaking out about it, you shouldn't, because that should be happening 88% of the times of the cases.
And isn't BPM? And one thing we have to always talk about BPM. I think I emphasize this myself a lot when I'm looking at going, team performance matters. So if you're an off cycle kid, let's say you're like a Damon Bailey. Yeah, you're sandwiched between, or a kid that's sandwiched, like Brian Evans is probably the best example. It's sandwiched between two super classes. you may see some sort of regression in statistical measures because the older kids have now matriculated out. He was the beneficiary of being the fifth option on offense. Now he's the first option. More eyes are on him, and the other guys haven't developed fast enough to get him into the position where he can replicate. He's still a really, really good basketball player. He's still a Big Ten Player of the Year caliber player, Big Ten scoring leader. But it's a thing, and it's a thing where we just have to kind of keep in mind that you are going to see regressions because sometimes the team itself doesn't play at the level they were playing at the year before when the kid had that big jump.
Yeah.
Not everybody. I was going to use EJ Liddell as an example of this because EJ Liddell just jumped BPM by a factor of 3.5 almost every year that he played in the 3 years with Ohio State.
Yeah.
The other thing with EJ Liddell was, he had some definite games where he looked like the 11.5 player he was as a freshman. He also had other games where the variance as a freshman is so great because the peaks and valleys are so much different, I think, for freshman players.
Sure.
Because some days they look like world beaters because they are world beaters. And other days it's just not working for them. And coaches are going to be pretty quick to pull that player because the mental connections just aren't built up enough yet to kind of get that through. Yeah. But I like seeing this because it kind of does show that, just as an aside, if you're a year 4 player and you're a 3.6 box BPM player, you're still average. The average is 11.6 points a game. Yeah. That's not a bad basketball player. That's a high contributor on a team. So, those top 100 players will pay off if you can get them there, if you can get them to their senior year.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, it's I think it's one of the themes I think we'll always be kind of hammering on in the show is how much of an influence that experience is in terms of interacting with players' performance, just because, I think I'm always the one that gets accused of over focusing on talent, in which, I fully admit that's probably true in a lot of cases, but, it's almost like there's so much of it is just like an XY axis. And, why so many of the things that we've shown before is on an XY axis is that, there's the talent level is the one variable, but then the experience is the other part. And you kind of need both to actually be a functional basketball player at a high level. So, generally, unless you're an Anthony Davis type, you kind of need to be at least like a junior, senior, and have a certain minimum level of talent to be like one of those 7, 8, 9 BPM kind of players. So I think will probably be a consistent ongoing conversation for us. And
if everybody's trending upwards, if everyone's trending upwards, how do you separate yourself to win? That's the question we go back to. And this is again where Miyakawa was, he kind of hitting it in his article.
Yeah.
The variable factor is, do these guys know each other? Are they able to play well together? You watch kids when they play, they adjust to themselves and they don't even know they're doing it. The more they play together, the more they can adjust to each other, the more they get a feel for each other. I know Billy's going to be here, and if I get him to pass this way, he's going to hit the shot.
Yeah.
And part of the deal with all the video and all the analytics is that coaches are now more and more kind of, showing those kids this, but you pick a lot up just by playing with teammates over an extended period of time. And freshmen have the disadvantage of not being in that position. Plus they also have the disadvantage of they've always been the best player on their team. Not always, but most, especially in the Power 5 level, they're the focal point of that team. Like Braylon Mullins, we were talking about him. His world's going to be different when everybody's not just focused on him.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it does play huge influence on terms of a kid, especially a freshman coming in terms of what their surrounding talent looks like. How do they fit into the team, and how do the team pieces fit around them to allow them to become the players they're going to become. So that's a very good point. So I think we should talk about the future freshmen in the next segment. When we come back, we'll talk about just that. What is it going to look like in the future for freshmen in the portal era, as maybe there's going to be a little less emphasis on going after the top freshmen for teams, but just knowing that freshmen have to go somewhere. So how are coaches and everyone else going to be using freshmen in the future? When we come back on X's and Joe's.
So we ask ourselves that question at this point here on X's and Joe's, the future of freshmen. And I think, we've already kind of hit on a lot of this, but just to kind of wrap up quickly, Mike, I think a lot of it does come down to, we're not going to know a lot more till probably at the end of next season when we see what the portal looks like, right?
Probably, yeah.
I mean, that COVID anomaly is the variable we can't really measure for.
Yeah. It's like the bubble that has not moved through the system yet.
And then you put the counterweight to that, which actually may not be a counterweight, may also be we don't know where the weight on this one is, but NIL and the whole idea of programs and how they're going to compensate players and the revenue sharing, all of these factors kind of converging on this in college sports at this time. And you have 18-year-old kids and parents, families trying to navigate all of this, as well as college coaches, as well as NIL collectives. And what does the average fan have to say at this point in time? Should you be paying attention to freshman recruiting? And my question back to you is, are coaches paying attention to it?
Yeah, I don't think they're paying attention to it let's put it this way. I don't think they're emphasizing it as much as they used to. I think they're certainly keeping tabs on it. And there's, I think we tend to get into these basketball conversations and there's an either or sort of mindset that we sometimes get into. It's like, it's like a South Park episode. It's like, everyone thinks that you have to go all one way or all the other, when the reality is usually somewhere in the middle. And so I do think that incrementally, I don't think as many resources are going to be spent on freshmen as they have in the past. That said, I think there's always going to be some kind of equilibrium that's going to be set. Is that anytime like a market gets flooded on one side, then obviously it's going to create market opportunities for the other. And so maybe we're going to have a bit of a flood over effect with so much attention going into the portal, and that market gets a little bit oversaturated, then there's going to be a little bit of equilibrating back towards the high school kids. So I don't know, like you said, it's still TBD. I've always said that, or at least I theorized in the last year or so, that I think there's going to be some kind of optimum balance between let's say high school recruits and the portal. Yeah. I don't know exactly what that is. Obviously what I'm doing with, let's say, looking at national championship teams and Final Four teams, I'm paying a lot of attention to UConn and obviously what they're doing, because they seem to have a pretty interesting model that has a little bit of both. You can get a kid like a Steven, you can get a kid like Castle, who's like a one and done. Then you can go combine him with kids like Caravan and Klingham, which are decent upper end, sweet spot kind of kids. And you throw in Tristan Newton and Cam Spencer portal guys that, basically take, the top two scoring spots. So I don't know exactly what the formula is, but clearly I don't think it's going to be one or the other, but I think that coaches are probably going to find some opportunities that maybe are going to be a little bit anomalous compared to what maybe they've been doing before in the pre-portal era.
And when we talk about portal guys, there's also, and this is, again, Miyakawa had, talking about UConn, I think differentiated that, Tristan Newton was a 2-year guy. Cam Spencer was a 1-year guy. Stephon Castle was a 1-year guy. So he's looking at 60% of that team. Well, he was actually there for 2 seasons, which kind of puts him more into the culture. But it's also, I think, the conclusion of, but if you can get, if you're doing what Shaka Smart's doing at Marquette, for example, or some would argue what Matt Painter did at Purdue, more, where you just kind of maybe take 1 or 2 transfers here and there. And this year, Purdue didn't take anybody.
Yeah.
It's going to be, I think you're right that the study point for us is going to be continuously looking at who's figuring out the right balance. Oh, and by the way, this is true multiple choice. There can be more than one right answer. There will be more than one right answer. Ultimately, it's going to come down to, are you getting the job done on a daily basis? And again, you got to look at coaches. I mean, I think back oftentimes, of someone teaching freshman composition, and pleading with his class. It's my job. You have to take writing these papers seriously.
Yeah, the great professor role that
Donald Sutherland, who we've
at Animal House, exactly,
who we've mentioned before.
How many movies of his have we mentioned on this pod by now? It's got to be.
I know we've already done the Dirty Dozen. That one was obvious. We have not. You and I can't do Hunger Games because it's almost passé. I think.
Yeah, we mentioned Kelly's Heroes at some point.
We did mention Kelly's Heroes.
Yeah.
We also mentioned Ordinary People.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, I'm sure people are like, "What the hell is that?"
Look it up. Find it on streaming. It's worth your time. You'll find yourself feeling sympathetic towards Donald Sutherland and hating Mary Tyler Moore at the end.
And also, just you can look up Google Ordinary People and Wedding Song, and you'll realize that the song that's now played, the canon in D, the most common like approach song in weddings, popularized by that movie.
May explain why we have such a high divorce rate in the United States.
Exactly. I remember reading that and someone talking about it. I was like, oh yeah, well, Ordinary People, that came in 1980. Everyone like started playing at their weddings. Like, you watched the movie, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not
what it's actually about.
Happy ending was not. The movie was not happy in any way, shape, or form. Really, Yeah. But that actually speaks to the breadth of the great Donald Sutherland, that we can, talk about Animal House, Ordinary People, The Hunger Games, the movie MASH, the original Hawkeye Pierce, and Kelly's Heroes and The Dirty Dozen, which, Sutherland and if you think about it, after Bill Walton, what's that?
Clute.
I don't remember. Yes, yeah. There you go. A Time to Kill. He plays the I mean, you go down the guy was like, it felt like he was in everything.
He was, yeah. Yeah, I do think it's appropriate, I guess, in a sad way that that Bill Walton had passed away.
Yeah.
Because if you think about like all the actors in that sort of that era, that like 50s through 70s era, and just as a casting question, like which one of those actors would have been most appropriate to play Bill Walton in a movie? It would 100% be Donald Sutherland.
Donald Sutherland. He could pull it off.
Tall. He was like 6'4". He kind of had that sort of like skinny, like head look. And he was kind of hippie himself, like back in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, yeah. Definitely
his character in Kelly's Heroes kind of had that vibe. It was almost like a pre-hippie in that movie.
Almost. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A little different than the sort of like, sort of guy you don't want to live next door to that he had in The Dirty Dozen. Where that's just a little odd. Yeah. So, well, again, it's rest in peace to the great Donald Sutherland. And again, we just, it's one of those things where as we kind of go through the next few the next few weeks, we're going to be talking a little bit more about other things. But once again, X's and Joe's, we want to give a special thanks to Bob Thompson for the music and sounds you hear on the show. And a special thanks to John Ringer of rigdesign.com for designing the logo and the look of the show as well.
Great. Yeah. And looking forward for the next episode, episode 13, does a program's history really matter? We'll explore how a basketball program's level of, let's say, relative success in its past, how that plays an influence on its performance in the present, and also the ways in which it doesn't matter very much. So look for that to drop in about 2 weeks, maybe second week of July.
Get Mike back from Indiana. Let's get you back from
Indiana. Yeah.
My wife said, "Why don't we do it together live?" And it's like, no, because honestly, it's like you don't want to be sitting next to me doing that.
it would be 4 hours.
It would be.
We would have to put we'd have to put some kind of warning on there because there'd be some inappropriate commentary of some kind at some point.
And there'd be 5.
The Back Home Network should not be associated with anything that we would do in our typical conversation.
Random guests that followed through at Nick's when they realize where we are and what we're doing. And it's like some of them need to be pretty much they let you out. They let you out.
that would be an interesting experimental idea. So,
yeah.
Oh man. So until then, this Endless Conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including the Assembly Call, the Dribble Drive, Doing the Work, Right Up Meridian, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and BackHomeNetwork.com. Until next time, I'm Mike Weemuth.
And I'm Bob Motes.
Have a good one, folks.